So performance principles, when you look at sort of the list of the 12 principles of animation, this group here are the ones that I'm going to do a little bit of an intro to. We've looked at anticipation already to a degree. Talk about that a little bit more. We've looked at pose to pose and straight ahead action with the tail ball, and secondary action, and also exaggeration. But this is sort of just rounding off the last few principles in the list of 12. In anticipation, usually anticipation is an action that happens to get the audience prepared for an action. So it could be a magician. If they're going to pull a rabbit out of a hat, they may make a big gesture with their arm before they reach in, rather than just like just go in and grab the bunny. A little bit more theatrical. So you're trying to direct the audience's eye, pay attention to this hand, I'm going to use it and do something. It can help stage an action really clearly. Sometimes anticipation is just part of biomechanics. If you need to jump, the only way you can get that energy is by bending your legs, because the only thing you have are muscles and you can only straighten them. So if you don't bend, you can't straighten anymore. So you can't jump as high. So anticipation can be performance. It can also be mechanics, but it's an important part of what we do to help prepare the audience for an action. Now, here's an example of a jump without anticipation. So this almost feels like the character is being flicked into the air. All of a sudden, something just boink, and they just jump into the air. There's no anticipation. If I go back and put in the anticipation, does that make a little more sense what's going on? So it's just to show I'm preparing to jump. It makes it feel like the character is jumping rather than something is lifting it up or pushing it off the ground suddenly. So this little change that we do just before we get into the jump helps prepare us, right? Helps prepare for the action, makes it feel more believable. Now, pose to pose animation, that's the way that we've been working pretty much through the entire term so far, with the exception of the tail in the tail ball. So pose to pose means that you start by making keys, right? You start by making positions throughout your scene on your timeline, and then you start adding in between positions to connect from key to key, and that's usually called pose to pose. So you start with a plan, right? So I have all of these keys, these major positions that I've got. I have the character standing, they do an anticipation, there's a stretch pose when they're jumping off the ground, there's a high point up in the air, there's another stretch pose when they're gonna land, then there's an overshoot and settle when they hit that low point, and then they stand back up. So these are the first poses I would draw out probably in a storyboard to figure out the action. And then I would add more detail and more keys and breakdowns and extremes to get to the final animation. But I'm working with big gaps, right? That's pose to pose. You're not going and animating every frame sequentially. You're putting gaps in between the movements to plan them out, to have like a clear target in your head before you start making all the drawings and all the positions. Now, straight ahead action is basically, the best analogy is stop motion. So in stop motion animation, you have a puppet, you move it a little bit, take a picture, click, move it a little bit, click, move it a little bit, click. So they work frame to frame. They work linearly frame to frame. And if there's any mistake or any problem, it's usually a shot killer. And you got to rewind, reset, and redo the whole shot from start to finish again. So stop motion is a very unique art form because what you're looking at is a unique, one-of-a-kind performance. It cannot be edited very easily. It is what it is. If it doesn't work, it is redone, right? So it's a very, very different way of animating. You have to have a very good understanding of spacing and timing to work with stop motion, because if you get it wrong, it's very hard to go back and fix it. So a lot of planning goes in. So straight ahead means every frame you're making a position. And this is an example of something I animated straight ahead. I didn't really know what I was going to do. I just had the character jump, and I got kind of tired. I thought I'm not going to have them fly for very long, so I just had them fall flat on their face. And if you see the action very clearly in your head, straight ahead can give you some very wonderful results because it sort of embraces chaos. You're trying to figure out everything as you go ahead, right? And some actions lend themselves to this really well. So if somebody is falling down the stairs, it's sometimes very difficult to do that pose to pose because you want all of that stuff working together. It's kind of like organized chaos. You don't worry about poses. You kind of just try and get everything at once. But it has a very high failure rate. If you don't get it right, you have to start all over again. So it's usually you try and do a bit of both. You try and do a little bit of planning with pose to pose, and then use straight ahead to give you flexibility, to give you more organic connections, to think of all the parts working together rather than isolated little bits. One of the problems with pose to pose is because you're working with these very clear poses, is sometimes you can see the character freeze and they hit those poses. So what we're trying to do is use straight ahead to make sure we're using those poses as guides, but we don't feel like we have to stick to them. That we use drag, overlap, and follow through to go through poses and connect and get that fluidity. So pose to pose gives us the ability to plan, and straight ahead gives us that really nice organic feeling of movement. So it's usually a balance between the two. Some people work completely straight ahead, other people may work layered in CG, other people work pose to pose, but it's usually not one or the other. It depends a lot on what you're animating, and it's always a bit of both. But you're trying to really get sort of fluid movement, right? Frame by frame, just going straight ahead. And it takes a lot of experience to get right, because most of the time you're making a guess, and a lot of times those guesses are wrong. But when it works, it's very fluid. So with these two, again, as I mentioned, pose to pose is really clear. It's a very good roadmap, but it can feel a little stiff sometimes, hard to loosen up. Straight ahead has basically, try to do controlled chaos. It can get very fluid, but it also has a very high failure rate. If you don't get it right, you got to throw everything away and start all over again. So again, neither method's perfect. It's usually a combination of the two that does the best. Okay, so you try and plan some poses and then use the controlled chaos of straight ahead to go through those poses and correct them as you go. So you would put in the keys and say, like, I know these are going to change. I think for me, that was a big learning point, is when you make a pose, when you're new, you feel very attached to it because you spent time making it. But, how on earth could you get it right? Especially something like somebody falling down. How could you know that the arm would be in the right place, right? Or the head would be in the right spot? So you throw it down as an idea, but just being very flexible about, it's just a guess. When I get there, I'll probably have to make adjustments. I'll probably have to have another piece of paper. I'll change stuff, but it's only when you have enough drawings that you can flip through and see the movement that you'll be able to understand if it works or not. Now, the other principle here is secondary action. We talked a little bit about this with the tail ball, but secondary action is a little bit different. Secondary actions you sometimes relate to performance, and the example here from the book, right, is that secondary actions or other actions in the body, for example, the main action would be the character is standing and they turn from camera, but you do this little secondary action where they wipe a tear from their eye. That's a secondary movement, right? The main movement, the primary movement, is the character moving, right? They're using their legs, their hips, their legs to move through a scene, but the secondary thing is them doing a little bit of performance on the face. So it's not as important to figure that out first because you need the whole character to be moving. It's done after. Some people use this term to talk about drag and overlap and follow through, but they try to make a distinction here that secondary actions can sometimes talk about performance. So another example is like somebody could be talking to someone, but they could also be on their phone, right? So the primary action would be I'm having a conversation, but at the same time I'm clicking buttons. So there's two things going on, but the main action is what's the person doing in terms of performance, and the secondary action could be, that's just more nuanced, to add a little bit more variation. Instead of a character just staring there, you're keeping them alive doing something, so the performance is more interesting. Okay, so here I took that little jump that I did and had the character flap their arms at the top. So the primary action is still the jump, right? But at the top of the arc, the little arm flap is secondary. Now, exaggeration, this has to do a lot with, again, squash and stretch to some degree, but exaggeration can also mean how somebody reacts. It can be how much you push an action, how much energy it has. You can do something that may look really weird as a still, but when you see it move, it works really well. And again, this was a good example. Did I go through this one too quickly? Exaggeration meant more distorted, or an action so violent it was disturbing. They found that they'd missed the point. When people ask you to push things, if you do it very incrementally, they may not notice any changes, and they're kind of like, more, and you're just kind of nudging. When somebody says more, I'll tend to go really far so that they'll be like, whoa, that's close, Brett, but man, you went way too far, bring it back, right? So big changes sometimes are needed so people can really see that you've changed things. And it helps you kind of spiral in on what you're trying to communicate, because it's a very easy note to give someone, but what does it mean, right? When somebody says, you know, could you just exaggerate a bit more? It needs a bit more oomph, or it needs a bit more punch. As an artist, when you're new, you may not know what on earth they're talking about, right? Because it's so vague. So that's when you would lean on your supervisors and say, hey, I got this note. I know what they mean. And they're like, oh, you know what? I know the director. I know what they like. Trust me, we'll figure something out. And then you'll sit down and brainstorm an idea and see if it'll fly. So an example here, if you look at sort of the frame by frame, there's one position that I drew, which was really to exaggerate the squash. And it's only one frame. You're never going to really see it, but you're going to feel. It's going to make that impact feel much stronger, just the way all the stuff gets spread out before the character returns to their sort of, you know, typical shape or typical volume. It's just there to accent that one moment, right? Just to really get that to feel a little bit stronger. So you could get rid of this drawing and see how it feels without it. And then I would just keep adding more extreme positions until I felt I broke the shot, that it's like, it doesn't work anymore. Now it's beyond the character. It just looks really silly. Then I know I've gone too far. But, you know, again, dialing in that little bit of subtlety depends on who's approving your work. Okay. So again, little summary. Anticipations are very important for helping direct the audience's eye and also preparing the character to do movements that sometimes require preparing to do anything. When you're using pose to pose and straight ahead, they usually play off of one another. Usually we start with pose to plan and straight ahead to go through keys to try to help them feel more fluid. And secondary actions can be really fun things that you can add to a character's performance to help sell the main idea, but make it more interesting and more organic. It's very rare that people are usually just doing one thing at a time. Sometimes, again, if there's a conversation between characters, they're rarely just talking to one another. They might be doing something while they're talking. So it helps it feel more interesting, right? Much more interesting than just two people talking at each other. And then using exaggeration as a way to caricature movement or to caricature your poses. It's something you can see in all kinds of animation, even stuff that's in live action film. You can't tell me that the way they animate the Hulk is realistic, because there is no Hulk, right? It's believable. So there's always a bit of caricature going on there. You're always trying to animate something that doesn't exist. So you borrow from what you can observe from real life and extrapolate, and just try and find that spot where people will say, I believe that, I think that works, or no, I don't. And then you have to kind of try it again and get different ideas.